What would you do if you ventured into a forbidden jungle for a simple school camping trip, only to find yourself trapped in a gathering of ancient spirits with a thirst for revenge? What if the person standing next to you, your best friend, your crush, your classmate, suddenly became a vessel for something far darker than any ghost story you'd ever heard? This is not fiction. This is not a myth passed down through generations to scare children around campfires. This is a documented case of mass possession that occurred in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Indonesia in 2016, where a group of unsuspecting students walked into a nightmare they could never have prepared for. And if you think this can't happen to you, keep watching, because by the end of this story, you might find yourself checking the shadows in your own room a little more carefully tonight. Don't forget to subscribe. Some stories demand to be witnessed, and trust me, you don't want to face what comes next alone. Before we descend into the full terrifying account of what transpired in that cursed jungle, you need to understand the true magnitude of the horror that awaits. Imagine standing in a circle of friends, laughing, completely unaware that one of your own is about to be taken. Picture a young girl, frail and sickly, suddenly possessed by a spirit so powerful, so consumed by centuries of rage, that she speaks in languages she never learned, moves with a grace that defies her weak body, and stares into your soul with eyes that have seen empires rise and fall. Imagine watching helplessly as students one by one lose control of their own bodies, contorting into unnatural positions, screaming warnings of blood and tears yet to come. And imagine discovering too late that someone within your own group has been orchestrating this nightmare, seeking power from forces that should never be summoned. This is that story. Our tale begins not in the jungle, but in a quiet room where two young men sit across from each other, engaged in a conversation that will peel back the layers of one of Indonesia's most chilling supernatural cases. One of them is a journalist, a writer seeking to document the truth behind the events of 2016. The other is Miko, one of the students who survived that camping trip, who witnessed things no human should ever see, and who carries scars both visible and invisible from that fateful journey into the heart of darkness. The journalist is working on a book, a comprehensive account of what the media called a mass possession event. But he needs more than secondhand reports and sensationalized news articles. He needs testimony from someone who was there, who breathed the same air as those ancient spirits, who looked into the face of the entity known as Roro Putri and lived to tell the tale. And so he's come to Miko, armed with questions and a recording device, desperate to understand how a simple school camping trip transformed into a descent into hell itself. Miko, however, is not an easy subject. When the journalist asks him directly about the events, when he probes about rumors of black magic and supernatural bargains, Miko deflects. He doesn't confirm. He doesn't deny. Instead, he pulls out a collection of photographs from that trip, images frozen in time from before everything went wrong, and begins to speak, not in answers, but in memories. The location, he explains, was chosen deliberately. The students wanted somewhere unique, somewhere off the beaten path, somewhere that would make their camping expedition memorable for all the right reasons. What they didn't know, at least what most of them didn't know, was that the site they selected was a place the local villagers had learned to avoid for generations. It was a place where the veil between worlds grew thin, where spirits gathered in the darkness to dance and feast, and where foolish humans who dared to trespass rarely returned unchanged. But let us step back to before the terror. Back to when this was still just an exciting adventure that a group of students was eagerly anticipating. Before the jungle revealed its secrets, before the blood began to flow, we find ourselves in the preparation phase of the camping trip, watching as students bustle about with the nervous energy and excitement that comes before any school excursion. Among them are two girls whose friendship will become crucial to the events that follow, Rini and Nayla. Rini is the quieter of the two, physically frail, plagued by breathing difficulties that make any strenuous activity a challenge. She had initially resisted the idea of going on this trip. Her concerns were practical. What if she had an episode in the middle of the jungle? What if she held her team back during competitions? What if she fainted and became a burden? But Nayla, her best friend, had dismissed these worries with the casual confidence of youth. There would be people to help her, Nayla insisted. Miko. In particular, there was a clear warmth between Rini and Miko that everyone could see, even if neither of them had ever spoken it aloud. With friends like that watching over her, what could possibly go wrong? What indeed? Their teacher and team leader, a young man named Haru, along with his companions, Miko and Mada, had taken on the responsibility of organizing this entire expedition. Part of their preparation involved the preliminary visit to the camping site, and it was during this visit that they first encountered the ominous atmosphere that hung over the location like a shroud. There, deep in the jungle, stood a structure old, weathered, seeming to belong to another time entirely. The locals believed that spirits still gathered there, holding their own celebrations, dancing in ways that human eyes were never meant to witness. This was why the villagers stayed away. This was why the land had been left wild and untamed. But the students needed permission, Haru displaying the kind of determination that would later prove both admirable and catastrophic, led his friends to meet with the village chief to request official approval for their camping trip. The chief's reaction should have been their first warning. He was reluctant, visibly uncomfortable with the idea of a group of young people venturing into that particular part of the jungle. He sensed danger, he could feel it in his bones, he told them. Something would go wrong, someone would get hurt. He had seen it before, in other groups that had dared to trespass on territory that belonged to other beings. But Haru was persuasive. He took full responsibility for the expedition, promising that he would personally ensure the safety of every single student. He would watch over them, protect them, make sure they respected the land and its unseen inhabitants. Under this weight of promise, the village chief finally relented. Permission was granted, though not without a heavy heart and a warning that would go unheeded: be careful. Respect the spirits. Do not go where you are not welcome. With approval secured, preparations continued. The students were briefed about the location, shown photographs, giving guidelines for their activities. But certain areas were strictly off-limits. The village elders had designated specific zones that were absolutely forbidden, places where the spiritual energy was too strong, too dangerous for humans to disturb. When Nayla, curious and perhaps a bit paranoid from all the warnings, searched online for information about the site, she discovered disturbing reports. In 2004, 12 years prior, a camping trip had ended in disaster. Multiple students had been possessed by spirits. Others had vanished without a trace, never to be found. The locals had eventually sealed off the area, but over time people had forgotten. The warnings had faded, and now a new generation was about to make the same mistakes. Nayla tried to share this information with Rini, but her friend dismissed it with the practical logic of someone who doesn't want to believe in monsters. That was 12 years ago, Rini pointed out. Who knows if any of it was even true? These were just rumors, ghost stories designed to keep people away. Besides, they had permission now. They had a plan. Everything would be fine. Everything would not be fine. As the departure date approached, the students went through their final preparations. They were divided into teams for various activities and competitions. Equipment was checked and double-checked. And it was during this process that Rini's many medications were discovered, pills and tablets for her various conditions that she had packed with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to managing chronic health issues. Lydia, a senior student who would become one of the first to experience the horrors to come, gently suggested that Rini didn't need to bring quite so much medication. They had first aid supplies. They had emergency protocols. The extra weight in her bag was unnecessary. But Rini, always anxious about her health, always worried about being caught unprepared, couldn't bring herself to leave anything behind. She was fragile, and she knew it. What she didn't know was that her fragility would make her the perfect vessel for something ancient and powerful. The camping trip was also meant to include a cultural performance, a play that the students would put on for entertainment during the evenings. The play was titled Roro Putri, based on an ancient legend about a princess. During rehearsals, the girl originally cast in the lead role, a student named Kilki, suddenly fell ill. She was unable to continue, leaving a void in the production. It was Haru who suggested that Rini take over the part. He had noticed her birth date, marked on the cast list, fell on a significant night, the night of a full moon. Something about this coincidence seemed important to him, though he didn't explain why. Rini was hesitant. She was already self-conscious about her physical limitations, and now she was being asked to take on a demanding role in a language she didn't speak. The play was in Japanese and Rini had no knowledge of the language, but Hiru offered to help her learn, to guide her through the lines, and Nayla, always supportive, always pushing her friend to be brave, encouraged her to accept. And so Rini agreed, unknowingly stepping into a role that would blur the lines between performance and reality, between acting and becoming. But before we continue with the journey into the jungle, we need to pause and examine something crucial, something that the students wouldn't discover until it was too late. We need to look at what happened the night before their departure, when Miko, accompanied by some friends and the village chief, visited the camping site for final preparations. The village chief performed a ritual. This was not unusual in rural Indonesia, where ancient traditions often blend with modern life. What was unusual was the nature of the ritual. He placed various objects on a piece of cloth, offerings, protections, items meant to appease the spirits who called that land home. Then he buried these items in specific locations around the campsite, creating a protective barrier between the students and the entities that lurked in the shadows. He instructed Miko to tell everyone, "Do not go near the places where these offerings are buried. Do not disturb what has been placed here. Respect the boundaries." But as the village chief departed, Miko noticed something that troubled him. A figure moved at the edge of his vision, a girl, walking alone in the darkness. When he moved to investigate, the village chief stopped him with a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. A warning: do not go where the offerings are not buried. Some places are not protected. Some places are not meant for human feet. That night, in the village near the jungle, Miko was awakened by strange sounds, noises that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest. He went to investigate, driven by a curiosity that would prove to be a recurring theme throughout this story. Before he could venture far, the village chief appeared again, materializing from the darkness like a guardian angel, or perhaps a jailer. He reminded Miko of his warnings, of the need to respect the beliefs of the local people, to proceed with caution. Then he departed, leaving Miko alone with his thoughts and the unsettling sounds of the jungle. And then, Miko witnessed something that would only make sense in retrospect. He saw a young man, perhaps not much older than himself, digging at one of the sites where the village chief had buried the protective offerings. This stranger exhumed the cloth bundle, sprinkled yellow rice over it, reburied it, and then scattered more yellow rice on top. Miko didn't know what to make of this at the time. He didn't know that yellow rice is used in Indonesian mystical practices to call upon spirits, to invite their presence rather than repel it. He didn't know that this act was not protection, but invitation, a deliberate unsealing of the barriers that the village chief had so carefully constructed. As soon as the stranger departed, the air changed. A chill wind swept through the area, carrying with it the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The jungle was waking up. Now we come to the day of departure. The students arrived at the edge of the jungle in 2 pickup trucks, crossing an old bridge that would later become significant in ways none of them could imagine. Rini, whose health had been a constant concern, nearly collapsed as she disembarked from the vehicle. She was weak, weaker than she had let on, and the journey ahead would test her in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. As the group trekked into the jungle, passing a bridge made of bamboo, a structure that would later become their only escape route, and then a prison keeping them trapped in a nightmare, Rini began to see things. Or rather, she sensed them. A presence at the edge of her vision, a figure that was there and then not there, a feeling of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living person. She stopped in her tracks, causing a traffic jam of students behind her, earning scoldings from seniors who didn't yet understand what was happening. Rini kept these experiences to herself, already accustomed to being the weak one, the burden, the problem. She didn't want to add crazy to the list of things her classmates whispered about her. By the time they reached the campsite, Rini was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the hike. Her body ached, her head swam, and something inside her felt different, changed, as if something had been waiting for her and had found her at last. The first sign that something was wrong came during the opening prayer. The students had gathered in a circle, eyes closed, heads bowed, reciting prayers for safety and guidance. It should have been a moment of peace and reflection. Instead, Rini felt herself being approached not by a person, but by a presence. A girl was walking toward her in her mind's eye, drawing closer with each passing second. Overcome by an inexplicable terror, Rini's eyes snapped open, and she fell backward, disrupting the entire ceremony. Everyone stared. The whispers started immediately. There she goes again, making a scene, being the problem. Rini retreated to her tent, humiliated and confused. Nayla followed, concerned, asking what had happened. Rini couldn't explain. She didn't understand it herself, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not alone in her own body anymore. From this point forward, the story descends into chaos. Lydia, the senior student, had been tasked with setting up banners around the campsite. In doing so, she inadvertently wandered into one of the forbidden zones, the areas that the village elders had warned them to avoid. She didn't realize she had crossed a boundary until she found herself in a clearing that contained a tent she didn't recognize. Whose tent was this? Who had set it up? She radioed Miko, asking if he knew anything about an unauthorized campsite in the restricted area. Miko told her to wait, that he was on his way, but Lydia, confused and increasingly frightened, decided to investigate. She entered the tent. The world inside was wrong. The lighting, the atmosphere, even the air itself seemed different. Heavier, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. When she emerged moments later, the entire surrounding landscape had transformed. The trees were different. The path was different. She couldn't find her bearings. Panic began to set in as she radioed Miko again, desperate for help. But instead of Miko's voice, she heard something else through the static, a voice that was not human, speaking words of anger and accusation. They had trespassed. They had disrespected. They would pay. Then, as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, it ended. Lydia found herself back in the normal world. The jungle returned to its ordinary appearance with no explanation for what she had experienced. She sought out Miko, trembling, demanding that they leave immediately. But Miko, not having witnessed the transformation himself, tried to calm her down. It was probably stress, he suggested. The pressure of organizing the trip. She was tired, overworked, imagining things. Lydia wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the rational world still held sway. Meanwhile, Rini's condition was deteriorating, or improving depending on how you look at it. In the competitions that followed, the girl who had always been weak, always been a liability to her team, suddenly found herself possessed of incredible energy and strength. She ran faster than she ever had before. She moved with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. Her teammates were amazed. Her opponents were confused. But Maida, a student with a camera, captured something in his photographs that no one else noticed until later. In every picture of Rini, there was a shadow behind her, a figure, a presence that didn't belong to any of the students. The first major incident occurred during a game similar to charades. A student named Ronnie was supposed to act out words for her team to guess, but when she began, something went terribly wrong. The gestures she made didn't match the words she had been given. Instead, she moved in ways that seemed deliberate, meaningful, but utterly incomprehensible. Then she spoke not as Ronnie, but as something else entirely. A voice that wasn't her own announced that she had awakened, that she had risen, that revenge would finally be taken. Blood and tears would flow again, she prophesied. And then, in front of everyone, she climbed onto the bridge and jumped, crashing onto the rocks below. Miraculously, Rani survived the fall, but she began slamming her head against the stones, as if trying to destroy the body she inhabited. Her friends managed to restrain her, to drag her to safety, but the damage was done. The students were terrified. The trip had transformed from an adventure into a horror show, and they were trapped in the middle of a jungle that seemed to be closing in around them. Heru, their teacher and leader, was called to help. He approached the possessed girl and began reciting something not in Indonesian, not in any language the students recognized, but in Japanese. The effect was immediate and unexpected. Ronnie, the possessed student, began to calm, but Rini, who had been standing nearby, suddenly collapsed. She saw the girl again, the same figure that had been haunting her since they arrived. And this time, the figure didn't vanish. Instead, she climbed into Rini's lap, an impossible weight that shouldn't have been there but was. Rini fled to her tent, desperate to escape the horror. But the horror followed her. She saw shadows moving outside her shelter. She heard whispers in languages she didn't speak, and when she finally tried to sleep, she felt hands pulling her backward, dragging her into darkness, as if the tent itself had become a portal to another world. Miko and some other students had gone to fetch the village chief for help. But before they could return, more students began to exhibit signs of possession. Kilki, The girl who had originally been cast as Raro Putri before falling ill suddenly began laughing, a sound that was wrong, too deep, too knowing for her young voice. She too had been taken. Haru began his Japanese recitation again, and again it seemed to have an effect, though not the one anyone expected. Kilki's possessor began to speak, not to Haru, but to Rini, pleading, begging, as if Rini were someone to be worshipped rather than pitied. The village chief arrived and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. 3 students possessed simultaneously was no small matter. This was not a haunting, this was a full-scale spiritual assault. He began the process of exorcism, treating each student with traditional methods, prayers, and oils. But when Rini awoke, something had changed. The entity inside her spoke directly to the village chief, telling him she didn't belong here, that she should leave. The voice was not Rini's, the words were not Rini's, and when Rini herself spoke, it was with an authority and power that no frail, sick girl should possess. The entity inside Kilki and the entity inside Rani both deferred to her. They worshipped her. The village chief made a decision. They had to leave. Immediately. The bridge would be their escape, and they would cross it tonight in the rain, with whatever strength they had left. But when they reached the bridge, they found it broken, shattered, impassable. Someone or something had destroyed their only way out. The village chief announced that he would go back to the village alone to bring help. He would return with more people, more equipment, perhaps a way to rebuild the bridge or find another route. Haru promised to watch over the students in his absence, to keep everyone safe until rescue could arrive. And with that, the village chief disappeared into the darkness, leaving a group of terrified students alone in a jungle that wanted to consume them. But what the students didn't know, what Miko was about to discover, was that Haru had been playing a very different game all along. Miko had noticed strange things about his teacher's behavior, the yellow rice he had seen scattered around the campsite, the Japanese prayers that seemed to communicate with the spirits rather than banish them, and now, as he followed Haru deeper into the jungle, drawn by suspicion and a desperate need to understand what was happening to his classmates, he witnessed something that chilled him to his core. Haru was performing a ritual, a real ritual, not the protective ceremonies the village chief had conducted, but something darker, something that involved offerings of yellow rice and strange symbols drawn in the earth. And wrapped around him, coiling and uncoiling in ways that defied the laws of nature, was a snake of impossible size, a creature that existed in the physical world and yet didn't. A manifestation of the spirits Haru had been calling upon since before the trip even began. Miko ran. He had seen enough. He knew now that their teacher was not their protector. He was their betrayer. Haru had been orchestrating everything, summoning spirits, making deals, seeking power at the cost of his students' safety and sanity. Meanwhile, Rini was experiencing her own private horror. In her altered state, consciousness drifting between the physical world and the spiritual realm, she found herself face to face with the entity that had been haunting her, the girl she had sensed, the figure in the shadows. This was Roro Putri, the princess of the spirit realm, and she had a story to tell. Long ago, before the village existed, before the jungle became a place that humans feared, Roro Putri had been a spirit princess of considerable power and beauty. She had lived in peace in her realm until a human prince king's son from the world of men had discovered a way to cross between worlds. He came to her not as a conqueror but as a lover, or so he claimed. He seduced her with promises of eternal devotion, convinced her to leave her protected realm and journey with him to the world of humans. She trusted him, she loved him, and he led her into a trap. The king, the prince's father, had devised a plan to steal Roro Putri's power. The engagement, the love, the promises, all of it was a lie designed to bring the spirit princess within reach of human weapons. When she arrived in the human world, believing herself to be a bride, she was instead executed, murdered by the very people who had promised to welcome her. Her power was stolen, her dignity was violated, and her spirit was left to rot in a jungle that humans then claimed as their own. For centuries, she had waited. For centuries, she had watched as humans trespassed on her land, as they forgot what had been done to her, as the story of her betrayal faded into legend and then into myth. She had waited for someone to call her, to give her a chance at the revenge she had been denied for so long. And then Haru had come with his yellow rice and his Japanese incantations, and she had answered his call. But she had also found something else, something she hadn't expected. She had found Rini. Roro Putri could have possessed anyone. She could have taken Kilki, or Ronnie, or any of the other students whose minds and bodies had proven so easily breached. But Rini was different. Rini was weak, yes. But in her weakness there was also strength, the strength of someone who had endured, who had survived, who had never given up, despite every obstacle placed in her path. Roro Putri saw something in Rini that reminded her of herself. The outcast, the dismissed, the overlooked. And so she chose her, not merely as a vessel, but as an ally. The ring that Rini had found earlier, the ring that had seemed to appear out of nowhere, that had called to her with an irresistible pull, was Roro Putri's most sacred object. It contained power beyond imagination, the ability to control anything in any world. And Roro Putri had given it to Rini as a gift, a symbol of trust, a partnership between human and spirit. In exchange, Rini would help her take revenge on those who had wronged her, not hero, who had summoned her, but the line of kings that had murdered her centuries ago, a bloodline that somehow continued to exist in the modern world. But Roro Putri's plan was about to collide with Haru's own ambitions. The teacher had not summoned a spirit out of scholarly interest or even out of a desire to protect his students. He had summoned Roro Putri because he wanted her power. He wanted that ring, and he had been willing to sacrifice every student in his care to get it. When Miko returned to the camp with news of Haru's betrayal, the village chief, who had by then returned with help, understood immediately what had happened. The yellow rice, the Japanese prayers, the careful orchestration of events leading to this moment. Haru had been preparing for a ritual of his own, one that would allow him to claim Roro Putri's power for himself. And now, with the students gathered together and the spirits restless, the time for that ritual had arrived. Haru appeared before them, no longer pretending to be their protector. He demanded the ring. He demanded that Roro Putri give him the power he had been promised. And Roro Putri, whose rage at being used yet again by a human seeking power, might have destroyed him on the spot, but she had a better idea. She would give him what he wanted. The play, the performance that had been planned as entertainment, would go on, but this time, it would not be an act. This time the story would be real. Roro Putri would use Rini's body to act out her legend one final time, with Haru and the students as her cast and audience. The ending would be different this time. This time the princess would not die. This time the king would fall. What followed was a performance that none who witnessed it would ever forget. Under Haru's direction, though everyone knew now that he was not truly in control, the students took their places. They were in a trance, possessed, moved by spirits who had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Rini, now fully merged with Roro Putri, took center stage as the princess. Ronnie, recovered from her earlier possession but still under spiritual influence, played the king. And Miko, who had fought so hard to protect Rini, who had risked everything to uncover the truth, was cast as the prince, the role that would require him to betray the woman he loved. The performance was supernatural. The students moved with a grace that wasn't their own. They spoke words and languages they had never learned. They enacted the ancient tragedy with an emotional depth that went beyond acting, beyond performance, into something primal and terrifying. And when the moment came when the prince, following his father's orders, was supposed to strike down the princess, Roro Putri made her move. She changed the ending. Instead of accepting death, Roro Putri turned on her killers. She spoke new words, words that were not in any script, words that declared her power and her right to rewrite her own story. She turned the knife back on her murderers, striking at Miko, who, despite being possessed by the spirit of the prince, managed to resist at the crucial moment, catching the blade before it could enter his heart. The spirits in the audience, the students who had been possessed, the entities that had been summoned, responded to Roro Putri's power with terror and awe. She had done the impossible. She had defied the story that had bound her for centuries. She had claimed her own ending. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. Roro Putri emerged from Rini's body, manifesting as a visible presence that everyone could see. the real Rini returned to herself, confused and horrified by what she was witnessing. Her classmates in trances, her teacher exposed as a traitor, a ghost standing before her with an expression of eternal sorrow and triumph. And Roro Putri spoke to Harrow directly, asking him one final question. What had he truly wanted? What would he give for the power he sought? Harrow, arrogant to the end, demanded the ring. He had done everything, summoned spirits, endangered students, betrayed every trust for that one object, that source of ultimate power. And Roro Putri, with a smile that might have been pity or might have been contempt, turned to Rini. Rini understood what was being asked. She had the ring, she had the power, and she could give it to Harrow, letting him have what he wanted, or she could destroy it, ending the cycle of ambition and violence that had led to this moment. Rini chose destruction. She ran toward the fire that had been burning at the center of the performance area. The spirits tried to stop her. Heroes screamed for someone to catch her, but Rini was faster than she had ever been, driven by a strength that wasn't entirely her own. She reached the flames and threw the ring into the heart of the fire. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The fire blazed up with impossible intensity, then died just as suddenly. Smoke billowed outward, carrying with it the essence of Roro Putri, and in that smoke, all the possessed students collapsed. The spirits had been released. The ritual was complete, but Harrow was not free. Roro Putri's final act was to give Harrow exactly what he had asked for. In a way, he would have power, yes, he would have his desires fulfilled, but they would be fulfilled in his mind, not in reality. He would spend the rest of his life in a fantasy world of his own creation, unable to distinguish between his delusions and the real world. He would be trapped in a prison of his own making, forever chasing a power that would never truly be his. Rini, meanwhile, received a different gift. Roro Putri, grateful for the human who had helped her achieve closure, promised to protect her forever. She would remain close to Rini, a guardian spirit, a companion for life. The princess who had been betrayed and murdered would never allow her partner to suffer the same fate. When the smoke cleared and the students began to wake from their trances, they found themselves changed. They remembered everything or nothing, depending on how deeply the spirits had touched them. The village chief and his helpers moved among them, performing final cleansing rituals, ensuring that no spiritual attachments remained. They couldn't cleanse Rini. She wasn't possessed anymore. She was something else now. A human with a guardian spirit. A woman walking between worlds, forever marked by the events of that terrible night. 7 years later, Miko sat with a journalist, showing him photographs and telling the story of what had happened in that jungle. He explained that he and Rini visit the site every year. Not for closure, not for memory, but because Roro Putri demands it. The spirit princess is still with Rini, still protective, still present, and she is not ready to let go. In the final moments of our story, the village chief, one of the few people who fully understands what has happened, makes one last request. He asks Roro Putri, through Rini, to consider letting go. It has been many years. Rini deserves a normal life, a future, a chance to move forward without a ghost attached to her soul. Roro Putri turns to face them, and she smiles, an enigmatic expression that offers no answer, only mystery. Will she release Rini eventually, or has Rini become the latest chapter in a story that will never truly end? The story ends as it began, with questions, with uncertainty, with the unsettling knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. If this story has followed you, if you find yourself glancing over your shoulder or wondering about the shadows in your own life, then you understand the power of what you've witnessed. Some tales are told to entertain, others are told to warn, and a rare few are told because they demand to be heard, because the spirits within them refuse to remain silent. If Rini's journey stayed with you longer than you expected, let me know in the comments. If you've ever felt a presence you couldn't explain, or wondered whether the stories we dismiss as myths might hold more truth than we want to believe, I'd like to hear about it. And if you believe that some stories deserve to be shared, that they might help someone else feel less alone in their own unexplainable experiences, then consider subscribing, because the next story is already waiting, and it might be closer than you think.